One of my favorite parts of this Thanksgiving and people watching, which we all love, was a real-life reenactment of Stewie Griffith. I was standing here talking to somebody at Thanksgiving, and about over here where Chuck is sitting, my brother-in-law, I saw my beautiful wife. And she was engaged in conversation with her aunt and, just making sure that her aunt knew one of Kristen's gifts is listening, and she was listening intently. And one of my children walked up, Mom, 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 Mom. If you're an adult, you've been in that situation, and you have this thing that takes over. Now, I'm going to give my wife full credit. I genuinely don't think she heard this child the first 3 or 4 times. But I got to sit here and watch it, and it did not disappoint. Because I got to watch my wife's face do something where she has to recognize this is a teaching moment for my kid, but I still need to be locked into what I'm talking, my priorities of talking with this aunt. And as she continued to ignore her, her face showed every single time that they said, Mom, Mom, Mom. Her angst and her discomfort was growing. And then, out of nowhere, something took place. She had worked everything within her to just focus. I'm going to teach this kid a lesson at this point. They're going to know that they just can't interrupt me when I'm talking to somebody else. And the child recognized it. All they wanted was the attention. They wanted to get her attention, and evidently what they had been doing wasn't working. So, like all good kids, they stopped saying it. Kristen. That got her attention real quick. It was jarring for my wife to hear her name spoken from her kids because that's not what they normally call her. Why? They wanted her attention, and they knew that it would take something jarring to get a response, and boy, were they right. It got a response from her. That is not what you call me. Sometimes it does take a jarring call to receive a response. But it was on the list of priorities for my kid to figure out, this is what I want. Here's what I want. How am I going to obtain it? And today, we're going to be talking about this idea of priorities. And priorities is a different way to share your purpose. I don't know what lists that you've created this Christmas, but if your group chat on your family is anything like mine, everyone's saying, hey, send out your lists. Hey, I'm going Black Friday shopping. I need to know your list. Send your list. And we all have lists. If you do it old school and just text it, that's fine. Normally, we just share the Amazon list. Here's the cart. Just pick something out of here, right? But at the end of the day, it only helps if that list is prioritized for the individual. For instance, I don't want my kids' toys, so I make sure I don't send that list to them for me. Our lists have priorities. And if today, maybe you're struggling with purpose in your life. Maybe like the lists, you've been sitting there saying, I don't know what the purpose to my list is. Maybe you're struggling with motivation or self-worth or doubt or depression or uncertainty today. Let me tell you this, and if this is the only thing you hear in the message today, I want you to hear it loud and clear. You were created in the image of God, by God, with a purpose. You were created by the creator of the universe with a very distinct purpose that he wants you to fulfill. Our job is discovering what that purpose is and how do we live that out. Well, this is nothing new to us, especially if you are a believer or have believed in, put your faith in God before. You believe a lot of times that, yeah, I know I've got a purpose, but man, discovering that purpose, man, that can be difficult. And maybe it's not even as difficult, maybe I know, but it's easy for the world to compete with God's plan. And I think that's something that is very real in our life. It's easy for us to rearrange our priorities due to the tyranny of the immediate. And Christmas is no exception. All the places that you have to go and the things that you have to shop for and the parties you have to attend, all of the cards you have to send and the conversations you have to make people like my wife feel like they're being heard at this point because it is the spirit of Christmas. But distraction in December gets highlighted. And when we're in distracted mode, I'm going into the store to get one thing, and I see all of the other things around that remind me of all of the other things that I could do or should add to a list or should take care of, but it's not where it's not where I intended to go. This distraction easily creeps up in our life. James Clear, the author of the New York Times bestseller Atomic Habits, said it this way: if you do not actively choose a better way, then society, culture, and general inertia of life will push you into a worse way. The default is distraction, not improvement. I think James Clear was actually borrowing from the book of 1 John whenever he wrote this, because the book of 1 John chapter 2, verse 16 says this: for the world offers only a craving for the physical pleasure, a craving for everything that we see, and pride in our achievements and possessions. These are not from the Father, but from the world. And it's because of this sin, it's because of this self-determination of I want what I want and the priorities of not keeping God's purpose clear in our life that we easily become distracted and putting roofs over our head or mixing up our priorities or not keeping the main thing the main thing. And that's what we're going to look at in this very non-traditional Christmas story found in the book of Haggai. Many of you are familiar with the Christmas story found in Luke or maybe Matthew or maybe even Isaiah like Jerry read today. You find this comfort in this Christmas story of God sending his son to earth. And we know it well, but have we ever read it from Haggai's point of view? Haggai is found in the Old Testament. And we see that God always created a home among his people here on earth. That's where we need to start in the book of Haggai, that God always created a home for him among his people here on earth. It happened in the Garden of Eden, the wilderness tabernacle, the permanent temple on Jerusalem's peak. God has also not just created a home, but he has put earthly leaders in charge of protecting, building, upkeep of his temple here on earth. This was Adam, Moses, David, and the priests that God had declared. He had put their ring on their finger and said, this is your responsibility to keep this up. God bestowed on them the authority to oversee his home like King David was bestowed a signet ring. But Israel, like Israel is prone to doing, got their priorities mixed up. All of Israel's leaders, from Adam to their final king, chose at some point to live away from God's home, neglecting heaven's life for a dying earth. So God did something pretty jarring to his people to get their attention, to get the attention of his people. He toppled the temple and their dwelling. They were overrun and they were ransacked. They were removed, the signet ring was removed, but Israel's exile was apparent in their life. God shook them to the core, and that's where we're going to pick up the book of Haggai, because after they were removed from their land and removed from everything that was familiar to them, years later, they come back to their land. They come back and they begin building, they begin putting their life back together. Where they were far and away, they begin to put their life back together. And God sent a message to Zerubbabel and Joshua through the prophet Haggai. Zerubbabel, which is an awesome name, just FYI, we got a baby dedication coming up, and if that's your baby's name, I want to do the baby dedication because I promise I'll probably mess it up. But Zerubbabel was the political, he was the political guy, he was the governor. And Judah was the high priest, or Joshua was the high priest. And these two earthly leaders were put in charge and entrusted to tending to the presence of God's covenant. And God sends them a message through the prophet Haggai. And in chapter 1, verse 2, which is where we're going to be today, you can go ahead and open up. We're going to be jumping around all throughout chapter 1. But in Haggai chapter 1, verse 2, this is what it says. This is what the Lord of heaven's army says. The people are saying, the time has not yet come to rebuild the house of the Lord. Remember, everything was ransacked. Everything was torn apart. Their houses, the temple, everything was destroyed. So Haggai is sending this message that God gave him to the people. And then in verse 3 it says, Then the Lord sent this message through the prophet Haggai, Why are you living in luxurious houses while my house lies in ruins? This message from Haggai starts out with a very jarring reference that myself and many of us who are reading this today, we don't get. But it's the exact same thing that happened to my wife that was jarring, a call that was jarring. Because this is the end of the Old Testament, and every time that God sent a prophet to speak to his people, he did not he referred to them as his people. These were the people of God, God's people. And here, Haggai gets their attention by saying, the people. Just like one of my kids calling their mom Kristen, it was jarring enough to where they had to stop for a minute. Whoa, we're not just the people, we are God's people. We are God's people. Why are you referring to us as the people? Is because they had mixed up their priorities. God was distancing himself from them because of the choices that they were making. Haggai received a message from the Lord that rather than being my people, that they were just another people. See, construction on the temple began 16 years earlier after they had gotten back and out of captivity. They had started construction, but then they left it to go fix the rest of the stuff that was wrong. They began building houses and planting crops. They began doing all of the things that a society would need to do to succeed. And after 16 years, God's temple still lay in ruins. The work had been started, but it was not completed, and they had been busy with their priority list in fixing a culture and fixing everything that they knew needed to happen, that they put their own priorities above the priorities of God. That was their problem. Misplaced priorities. Now, I don't imagine anyone in the room would doubt that we've all had mixed up priorities in your life. Have you had ever mixed up priorities in your life? Yeah. We've all done it, and so this isn't something new. But whenever God chose to reveal it to them, that was the interesting part. He used a jarring reference, something to get their attention. We all have misplaced priorities in our life. Life be lifing, and we just start moving priorities around, just like walking into a store at Christmas. But Haggai's purpose was simple and clear. It was to motivate God's people to rebuild God's work, to complete the work that they had started on the temple. They were building their own houses, but ended up neglecting God's house. It was important to finish the building of the temple because only then could the people be fully restored to the Levitical law that they were called to worship in. They had gone into captivity for covenant unfaithfulness, only to come back. To finish the temple meant to prioritize the things of God in their life. The point is that they were doing what was natural to them. They were doing what came easy to them in taking care of their own needs, in fulfilling their own lists, in writing things down that they also needed to get done. Haggai refers to them as the remnant. Later on in the chapter, Haggai refers to them as the remnant. These people that were left over, these people that had made it back out of captivity, the remnant, everyone who was left, they had to start over, and that's what they felt. And it was easy for them to start putting, all right, I need a house for my family. All right, I need crops to feed my family. And they continued for 16 years to work on themselves, to work on their lists, where God on their list continued to get pushed further and further and further down. But what happens when Haggai reveals to them their fruitlessness of their purpose without God? In verse 6, he says this. Here's what he says in verse 6. You have planted much, but harvest little. You eat, but are not satisfied. You drink, but are still thirsty. You put on clothes, but cannot keep warm. Your wages disappear as though you were putting them into pockets filled with holes. See, the temple was the main purpose. The temple symbolized them putting their relationship with God first. The need to rebuild God's temple is urgent because temples in their world were the entire center for administering the political, economical, judicial, social, and religious life of their nation. Their life revolved around the temple because it solidified this relationship. When the temple was healthy, their lives were healthy. It symbolized it not only to them, but to other cultures around. When the temple was put as a priority in their life, this relationship was a priority in their life, and all of the other things that they sought after to make sure that they planted enough to eat, all of those other things began to satisfy less and less and less. Kind of like Greg was talking about last week with his consumerism idea. But to refuse to build the Lord's house was at best saying it didn't matter whether the Lord was present with them, or at worst, it was presuming on divine grace that the Lord would be with them and live with his people regardless of what they were willing or unwilling to do with him. See, the prophet exposes that the unfinished temple symbolized their disordered hearts. And rebuilding was about reordering the affections of a community that had grown inward focus and received discontentment in their actions. See, obedience, this is what they didn't really recognize. Obedience wasn't for God's benefit, but it was for ours. Obedience wasn't for God's benefit, it was for theirs. All of the other things in their life, their economical, their political, their judicial, all of their social things, all of the other things began to not satisfy. And so when God's saying, you forgot about me, you forgot about the temple, you forgot about the things that really matter, your priorities out of a place, everything else seems all chaotic. Have you ever felt like you were just caught in the race, going through the motions, not going anywhere, spinning your wheels? That's what the Jewish people felt like in this book of Haggai. Yet God was not sending them this message because God needed the ego boost. He was sending them this message because of his love for them. Because whenever you have a purpose for something, you have a plan for them. And God knew that his plan was the best for them, regardless of where their priorities were in that moment. Serving God benefits you. Serving God benefits me. Making sure that the temple in my life, that God is the priority in my life, serves all of the other areas of my life because it keeps his priority number one. Obedience to God is a blessing to you because his plan is what's best for you. Now I want to fast forward a little bit to verse 12. Verse 12 says this, all right, are you ready? Then Zerubbabel, son of somebody, and Joshua, son of somebody else, the high priest and the whole remnant, there's that word again, remnant of God's people, began to obey the message from their God. See, they didn't just hear it. Their actions dictated what they did next. They began to obey the word of God. Haggai refers to the people here, remnant, in two different ways. The remnant first is the leftover. These were the people that had made it back, the leftovers of those who had been relieved from captivity as survivors from the Babylonian exile. But also because as they obeyed, the remnant of what was left of the people looked more and more like God. As they obeyed what God called them to do, they began to look more and more like that. As they began to rebuild the temple in their community, they began to look more and more like God. Not because they were better, but because they were fulfilling the purpose that God had given them. It was only God that was left in their life. God's people should always be obedient within their covenant relationship to the Lord, where God is all that's left. See, Haggai reported the obedient and reverent attitude of both the leaders and the people. Not the compliant attitude of God's people, or not a complaining attitude. These are a people where their priorities became misplaced, and whenever they were addressed, they had an option on how to respond. Anybody ever told you that your priorities are misplaced? Hey, you've got some adjusting to do over there. You guys are better people than me, but whenever someone calls me out like that, man, my first thing is defensive. It's like, no, they're not. Oh, you just caught me on a bad day. No, it's not me. It's easy for me to put my fists up and say, nope, not me. Because that jarring call ends up hitting me in a place where I feel vulnerable. It's how we justify skipping church or skipping our devotions or your small group. It's how we justify, well, it's just this account that I follow. It's nothing that I'm seeking out. It's like decorating the tree before you bring it in. It's decorating our life before we're tending to the soil. It's decorating the things of this world. It's putting up all the decorations to make it look good on the outside, but on the inside, our soul is dying. Forgetting our physical comfort is not our spiritual necessity. See, when we realize that obedience isn't about God's benefit but ours, we have a different response to the jarring call that God places on our life, just like the Israelites did. Now, if you're familiar with the Old Testament, this is a big deal because so many times that's what the Israelites did. They put up their fists. God, no, I know you're calling me to do something and I don't want to do it. And we have time and time again, example after example in the Old Testament where God's people did not want to obey the word of the Lord. Yet here Haggai records the excitement that they began to obey God's message with. The prophets have a great track record of God's people rejecting the mirror that the prophets were holding up. And it was rare for a prophet of God to receive a good favor, but that's exactly what happened. In verse 14, it says this, so the Lord sparked the enthusiasm of Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and governor of Judah, and the enthusiasm of Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and the enthusiasm of the whole remnant of God's people. They began to work on the house of their God. God got their attention, and they had an attitude of obedience. And here, guys, I got real excited whenever I read this. I got real excited. I'm not going to try to Bible geek on you very much, but I want you to recognize this for a second, so bear with me. If I'm talking a little bit fast. There was a theological problem that they faced. There was a theological problem that the Israelites, when they were confronted with this message from Haggai, faced. And it's the same theological problem that we're faced with today. It was this question. Where was the activity and presence of God to be found? To the people of Israel, to the people here, where was the activity of God? Where was the presence of God to be found? Anybody? The temple. This is what was supposed to be happening, that everything that God's presence was supposed to be in the temple, and by neglecting the temple, by neglecting the duties that they were supposed to be taken care of, by misplaced priorities, they were ultimately neglecting the activity and presence of God in their life. Well, 1 Corinthians chapter 3 says it this way, don't you know, because once Jesus came, Jesus was born, Matthew. Now, later on in the New Testament, 1 Corinthians chapter 3, don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple? And that God's Spirit dwells within your midst? Oh my goodness, that spark of enthusiasm hit the people to where their obedience wasn't just compliance, it wasn't out of dread. They began to be excited about the work that God was calling them to do. Now in the Old Testament, God's presence wasn't just in the temple. It was in the innermost part, this section of the temple called the Holy of Holies. And in the Holy of Holies, you couldn't go in there, but in the Holy of Holies, only one person could enter every year. And in this Holy of Holies, there was the Ark of the Covenant, this representation of the covenant that God had made with his people. And there was a lid on the Ark of the Covenant, and that lid was called the mercy seat. And on top of that mercy seat is where the presence of God dwelt here on earth. This was God's earthly throne. And in Exodus 25, it says this, there I will meet you. From above the mercy seat, I will speak to you. This is the Spirit of God speaking to his people from the mercy seat, from within the temple in this Holy of Holies. And whenever God's presence appears in various other places in the Old Testament, it is represented by this fire. The burning bush, the pillar of fire, Sinai wrapped in fire. God described it, an all-consuming fire in Deuteronomy, and even the tongues of fire that laid to rest on the disciples, on the apostles in the upper room in the book of Acts. This representation of fire. And in the book of Haggai, do you remember what he did? Remember what he gave the entire people and the leaders? A spark of enthusiasm. It wasn't a guilt trip saying, you've done bad things, fix it. Okay. It was this spark of enthusiasm that was the Lord's presence in their life. This spark of enthusiasm in Zerubbabel, in Joshua, and in the whole remnant, in everything that was left to rebuild the temple, just as he said. God's people began to get excited about what God was doing in their presence. They began the work on the house of the Almighty. This spark of enthusiasm to finish the purpose that you were created for. Our life is a mission. We have a mission to fulfill that purpose, to seek and fulfill it. And that's why Jesus came. To be the place where heaven meets earth. To sit on this mercy seat, to engage his people with a spark of enthusiasm to complete the work, because we are the temple. And when we get our priorities mixed up, it's easy. It is so easy for us to continue. 16 years later, God begins a work in us that we refuse to complete. And sometimes, just like Christian, we get so caught up in our moment, in our conversations with other people, where my people, mom, and we ignore or we can't hear the call of the Holy Spirit in our life. And so he does something jarring in our life to get our attention. And once he has our attention, the question is, what is our response? Is our response to reprioritize the things that God is calling us to reprioritize? Or do we just sit there and say, well, if I ignore it, maybe it'll go away? I know I've got that. It's still on the list, but I've just got a couple other things I got to finish up first. See, when Jesus entered the rebuilt temple, after he came to earth in Advent at Christmas to be his presence here on earth, like Haggai, he revealed to the people of that time and to us today, he revealed our priorities. That spark of enthusiasm begins to hit. Jesus showed that though the temple was planted in the land, its harvest had been light. The things that it had been doing weren't fulfilling anymore. And though it looked alive on the surface, within it, it was as dead as night. God has always been building a home where heaven's life can heal dying earth. Because where God lives, death has no place. And so today, I want to ask that about our lives. And I'm going to ask the band to go ahead and come on up, and we're going to sing a song, and we're going to worship a little bit as we close out the message today. But I want to ask you, God has always used, or I want to tell you this, God has always used obedient earthly people in his home to build, tend, and keep his dwelling here on earth. God's activity and his presence is found in his temple, and you and I are his temple. And it is not up to us for the Holy Spirit to reveal our priorities in our life. The Spirit does that. But what would this world look like if, as his followers, as the remnant, as everything that's left is God's, as God's people, what would it look like if that spark of enthusiasm that he's put into your life, this Advent, made you excited for his plan, made you excited for his purpose? What is God calling you today? Imagine the books that can be written. Imagine the devotionals that will be shared. Imagine the conversations that will be had over dinner tables. Imagine the families that won't go without. Imagine the friends that won't feel lost in despair this Christmas. If we just are able, because of our obedience, to receive that spark of enthusiasm that lives within the temple of our hearts, that puts him on the throne, that says all of the political and all of the justice and all of the judicial things that take place and all of the social, that all becomes right when this relationship is correct. Sometimes it takes a jarring revelation, and I think some of us in here today, you might have had that, and like, don't be stepping on my toes. I like the way I've got my Christmas laid out. We've already got plans. We've already got stuff going on. And maybe some of you today, God checked your heart and said, yes, those aren't bad things, but you've forgotten the most important thing. If you found the things of this world to be empty or unfulfilling, whether it's a person that needs help or someone who needs help on the side of the road, or a family friend that needs you to watch their kids, or somebody to be able to pray with, I'm excited about this spark of enthusiasm that God is going to share with you and with me this Christmas. God has sent us the Holy Spirit, who is all-powerful, who desires to give you the same spark of enthusiasm that God gave his people. And that allows us to rearrange our priorities, our misplaced priorities, through the tyranny of the things that are happening in our life. God's temple exists where God's purpose takes top priority. And God's activity and presence can be found in his temple, and we are that temple. The home where we're supposed to bring life, but heaven was no longer inside. Earth's temple was not where God would reside. Instead, Jesus was God's presence in the land, and he would be the place where earth finds life. I'm excited for those stories this Christmas from you, where as God shows us our misplaced priorities, the things that we have put in our life, where we get to reacclimate and reprioritize and put God first in everything. I can't wait to hear the stories of how God is blessing each of us this Christmas and so many other people when we complete the temple that God is calling us to complete, when we fulfill our purpose, where his presence can be found among his people.